From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
The Fed holds rates and Chair Powell says confidence to cut them will take longer, but they aren't thinking about the political context of the looming election. Charlie Cook of the Cook Political Report is, though, and he'll join us on how the economy is factoring into the 2024 race.
We'll also ask him how dramatic scenes of pro-Palestinian protests and police force on college campuses around the country are weighing on President Biden. As Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in Israel pushes for a ceasefire with Hamas. Jane Harman, chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission, will have more this hour.
And the House just passing an anti-Semitism bill as Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene announces she will force a vote on her motion to vacate Speaker Mike Johnson next week. Our political panel will weigh in. Of course, Joe, that is one scenario in which we know pretty much how it will end if she does force that vote next week. House Democrats have said they will vote to table it. Mike Johnson will not be vacated. But we do have many lingering questions this hour where there are situations where we don't know how they will end. And ceasefire talks are one of them.
Yeah, that's for sure. You just mentioned the anti-Semitism bill that passed with a large margin in the House. A messaging bill, of course. There are a lot of questions about the administration's policy in Israel, however, as we see these pro-Palestinian protests continue at Columbia University and many college campuses all over the country with regard to a ceasefire and whether there is an imminent announcement. We heard today from Secretary Anthony Blinken. Here he is.
What we discussed today, among other things, was getting this agreement, which involves an immediate ceasefire, hostages home, and then working to build on it. And that's what we talked about today. So let's see if we can get this done. Look, I think this is something that the whole world is watching. And if Hamas actually purports to care about the Palestinian people and wants to see an immediate alleviation of their suffering, it will take the deal.
Let's go now to Bloomberg's Akayla Gardner, who covers the White House. So, Akayla, he's talking there about how this is something that the world needs or wants to see, but also domestically, the Biden administration really needs this to get done, right? Just how badly?
Yeah, so we understand there's a fresh proposal that was on the table in recent days. They continue to say this is really up to Hamas to really agree to this. And this is crucial for Biden because he really needs this conflict to de-escalate, particularly as we're seeing these protests across the country now in more than 30 states, as our data team has been tracking very well now. And it's anti-protests or anti-Israel protests, but it's also a huge frustration with President Biden. They feel like he could do more to alleviate human suffering in Gaza. And potentially these are young voters who could be crucial to Biden's reelection campaign. He really needs to retain their support if he wants to win in November.
Voters who were already wary about the policy in Israel and Gaza. This came up today in the White House press briefing in which Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre reacted to the forceful removal of student protesters at Columbia University. That took place last night after they barricaded themselves inside a hall on campus. Here she is.
Top line here, every American has the right to peacefully protest within the law. That is something that we believe. Seizing buildings, taking over buildings is not peacefully protesting. Students have the right to attend class and feel safe and feel like they are in a safe campus environment. That's what we want to see.
Akayla, this is a fine line this president is walking. Some of his critics, Republicans, are calling for him to show up on campus, a place like Columbia. The White House today says he'll speak at a Holocaust memorial event next week. Is that the venue for him to deliver this message?
Yeah, well, the White House and the president has really condemned anti-Semitic rhetoric that we have seen in some of these protests. He was asked about this directly in Virginia last week, if he condemns some of these protests, and he said he condemns the anti-Semitic rhetoric, but he also condemns people who don't understand what's going on in Palestine. So he's really walking a really delicate balance here to be able to, in some ways, please two different coalitions that are both really critical to his election.
Well, we'll be watching that speech closely next week. Akayla Gardner, thank you so much, covering the White House for Bloomberg. As expected, meantime, the Federal Reserve leaving interest rates unchanged today. Here's Fed Chair Jay Powell in his news conference earlier.
I think it's unlikely that the next policy rate move will be a hike. I'd say it's unlikely. Our policy focus is really what I just mentioned, which is how long to keep policy restrictive. You ask, what would it take? I think we'd need to see persuasive evidence that our policy stance is not sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation sustainably down to 2% over time. That's not what we think we're seeing, as I mentioned. But that's something like that is what it would take. We'd look at the totality of the data.
You saw the news conference and you heard it live here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and Bloomberg's Michael McKee was in the room for that. He's with us now at the table on Balance of Power. It's great to see you, Michael. A lack of further progress, not exactly what the markets wanted to hear. The changes in the statement, we should know what about?
Well, basically, they just acknowledged reality by saying that we have not seen the same kind of progress in the last couple of months. And that's just telling people that we see the same thing that you do, and that you're probably, it's read between the lines, you're probably not wrong to put off rate cuts and to think we might not do 3 this year. And then Powell backed that up when he gave his press conference.
Well, and he was asked a number of things in that press conference, including how, if at all, the Fed is thinking about politics and the context around which, if we're talking about fall rate cuts, for example, something in September, right before an election, he effectively said, that's not how we think about things. But really, Mike?
It's not. And he was right to say, go back and look at the transcripts. This is his 4th presidential election since coming on the Fed, and they don't talk about it. It's just an external factor that doesn't affect what they do. And that's been the Fed all the way through, except for the chairmanship of Arthur Burns in Richard Nixon's day, and nobody wants to be the next Arthur Burns. So they keep politics well out of it. I was a little surprised today that nobody asked about the Wall Street Journal story about Donald Trump advisors trying to find a way to sideline Jay Powell and basically take over the Fed. I'm not sure he would have had an answer for it. He probably would dodge it. But it was interesting that he wasn't asked.
Indeed. Maybe you'll ask that question next time. It's worth noting that even the Treasury Secretary and a former Fed chair herself, Janet Yellen, was talking about the idea of Fed independence today. Bloomberg's Michael McKee, always great to see you here in Washington. Thank you so much. Elsewhere on Capitol Hill, Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia says she'll be moving ahead with her motion to vacate House Speaker Mike Johnson next week.
I think every member of Congress needs to take that vote and let the chips fall where they may. And so next week, I am going to be calling this motion to vacate. Absolutely calling it. I can't wait to see Democrats go out and support a Republican speaker.
Let's go now to Zach Cohen, who covers Congress for Bloomberg Government. So, Zach, is this just a scenario in which Marjorie Taylor Greene is unable to back down?
This does seem like the last gasp of Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's efforts to punish Speaker Mike Johnson for his decision to put on the House floor this $95 billion package for Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel that she had been opposing for a long time. The problem is the votes just simply aren't there to actually oust Johnson from the speakership. Democrats have said that they would vote to table this motion to vacate, essentially giving the votes on a procedural vote to avoid even a final vote on vacating the chair from happening. This is very different than how they treated Speaker McCarthy when Kevin McCarthy from California, when he was in that job last year, where they actually did vote with Republicans that ultimately led to his ouster. And so clearly the votes are not there for Greene. You do have 2 other Republicans, Thomas Massie from Kentucky, as well as Paul Gosar from Arizona, who have said in the past that they would vote to oust Johnson if given the chance. But if that procedural vote does in fact succeed and Greene's motion is sidelined, then Johnson appears to be safe, at least for the next couple of months.
It's interesting, Zach, you bring us back to Kevin McCarthy. He helped Marjorie Taylor Greene quite a bit. She was an ally. He put her on some important committees. To what extent, months later now, is she isolating herself inside the Republican conference?
Greene really did have something of a resurgence under the McCarthy speakership. Remember, she came into Congress as a conspiracy theorist and somebody who entertained the idea of QAnon and other sort of theories that didn't have any basis in evidence. But when McCarthy came to power with a very narrow majority, about as narrow as what Johnson has today, he really took her under his wing, and she had a lot more power in shaping legislation and the House schedule. including in pushing for the impeachment of President Joe Biden and some other cabinet officials. But with McCarthy on the outs and not even in the House anymore, she doesn't really have that ally at the top anymore. And so this has been her opportunity to try to force Johnson, and was successful for many months in keeping Ukraine aid off the floor, something she vehemently opposes. But certainly at this point, Johnson, with the support of the majority of Republicans and Democrats, is able to stay in that job and really sideline Green from any of consideration here.
Great reporting, Zach. We appreciate the insights. Bloomberg's Zach Cohen with us from Bloomberg Government, more specifically today on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll take a look at the political effects of the pro-Palestinian protests across college campuses nationwide with Charlie Cook of the Cook Political Report. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's time to stop these anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas mobs today. And if liberal college administrators won't take action, the mayors and the governors of these campuses should. And so should Joe Biden. When will the president himself, not his mouthpieces, condemn these hate-filled little Gazas?
That was Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton earlier today reacting to the ongoing protests on more than 100 college campuses around the country. And for what it's worth, Joe Biden has condemned the anti-Semitic rhetoric that we're hearing on these campuses. He just hasn't shown up in person. We're joined now here at the table by Charlie Cook. I'm glad to say the founder of the Cook Political Report is with us. And Charlie, it's great to see you here. The president is in what we're calling a no-win scenario, or a make-or-break moment, depending on the analysis that you read here. Is he capable of turning this around? He's obviously not going to be showing up on a campus soon. He will speak at a Holocaust memorial event next week. Can he turn this around if he achieves a ceasefire?
You know, turn around, can you sort of make this survivable, kind of? I mean, ran across a guy about a month and a half ago who was saying, you know, President Biden is anti-Semitic. I thought, you know, you could think of a lot of things to criticize him on, but that's really kind of not, you know? But it is a no-win situation, so it's just how do you survive? You're not going to win it. But how do you navigate it and lose as little altitude as you can on it? Because he's got, you know, problems in every direction and doesn't need one more, but here you have one more that, you know, wasn't quite so much of his making.
Well, to your point that this wasn't really his making, a lot of this depends on the decisions of the Israeli government and Bibi Netanyahu, for example. So there are things that are in the president's control. This may very well not be one of them. Does this mean that he could really lose the election on this issue for lack of ability to fully
If we woke up the day after the election and President Biden has lost, I don't think we would focus on that. I mean, because there's just so many different elements that are weighing him down, and there's, you know, inflation, economy, and, you know, age, and I mean, so there's so many different things that are sort of zapping him that this is just sort of one more. But you can't. I mean, it's like you can't embrace him too tight to satisfy some people, and if you even talk to him, you alienate other people, and there's no coming out of that ahead.
We're going to walk through a couple of big issues, all of them divisive when it comes to this president. We just started the show talking about Jay Powell today and interest rates. It's entirely possible we see no rate cuts this year. Maybe, Charlie, we see a hike. That is not what the Biden campaign was banking on in this case.
Yeah, I mean, as we 3-year high. I mean,
sure. Yeah. So the economy, which is not working for people based on every poll we're seeing, is a major problem for him, and that might not change between now and November.
Yeah, and it's so selective that if you want to point to unemployment, if you want to point to GDP, you could say, oh, you know, and then you put these things that looks like, you know, horrific, and they're all true, but I think unemployment has never been as salient as inflation. You know, the difference between a low and a high unemployment is what, 3 points, 4 points? Yeah. But roughly 100% are affected by inflation or now higher cost of living. And the cost of living doesn't go down. I mean, short of a depression or recession or something. So it's an awful, and that these kind of races, it's a referendum up or down on incumbent. and 2020 was about Donald Trump. And, you know, naturally, 2020 was about Donald Trump, and 2024 is probably going to be more about President Biden.
Okay, so we've talked about a few issues that are working against him. Israel and these kinds of protests we are seeing in response are one. The economy is another. Perhaps one that he's really trying to seize and the campaign is trying to seize to work in his favor is abortion. Vice President Kamala Harris is in Florida today as the state's 6-week abortion ban went into effect, and she spoke about reproductive rights.
This is a fight for freedom, the fundamental freedom to make decisions about one's own body and not have their government tell them what they're supposed to do.
And Charlie, it's worth noting that while the 6-week ban went into effect in Florida today, just within the last hour in Arizona, the state Senate has voted to essentially repeal the Civil War era law that would have banned it entirely, except for in the case of the life of the mother. Can you just speak to this issue and whether a resolution like that in Arizona may take it more out of play in terms of the ability for Biden to get a state, whereas in Florida, people are talking about maybe it actually being in play and up for grabs for Biden because of the abortion issue?
You know, for Republicans, I think there are a lot of Republican elected officials that if they had this to do all over again, they really wouldn't be in this position. But there's an old Chinese proverb, he who rides the back of a tiger is afraid to dismount. And Republicans kind of rode this tiger, you know, for 20, 30 years, 40 years. And now it's dangerous to get off of it. But, boy, it's dangerous to stay on. And that if they go along with compromise too much, they alienate their base. But 6 weeks, wow, these are pretty unsustainable bills. Some of these are. I mean, this is not seeking a happy medium at all.
Better than the dog that caught the car, which we keep hearing in this analogy here. We could be mixing metaphors all day. But look, the man that Joe Biden's running against, we're talking about the president this whole time, is in court 4 days a week and is directly responsible, and as he would tell you, for the end of Roe v. Wade and the opportunity for states to do what they want here. So he's tacitly endorsed what any state is going to do. We've built a narrative here in this conversation of some tough issues for Joe Biden. Is abortion enough to overcome them?
I think some places it might be, but as across the board, I mean, I think a lot of Democrats think that in 2022, that's what kept them from having a completely disastrous area. But the data doesn't really support that. I mean, you had almost 10 million fewer votes, Democratic votes for Congress in 22 than you had in the previous midterm election, and almost 4 million more Republican votes. That what happened was they nominated some, my wife's trying to get me to stop using the term wacko to describe candidates on the far left or right, exotic and potentially problematic. Candidate that, like a potted plant, might have won this race, but they nominated somebody that was just a nut. And that's really, in about 24 races, that's what cost them having the kind of year that they probably should have had. So I don't think it was the abortion issue, but when it's the focal point, boy, it can be potent. Yeah. The Kentucky governor's race last year would be a great example.
Sure. All right. Wacko or not.
Exotic analysis.
Exotic and problematic.
Yes, indeed.
Charlie Cook, founder of the Cook Political Report. Always great to have you here on Bloomberg. Thank you so much. Now, coming up, the DEA is taking cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, an action that could have ripple effects across multiple industries. We'll have reaction from Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Thanks for joining us. Today, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer held a news conference to reintroduce the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, which would legalize marijuana on the federal level. Few see it passing anytime soon. But the effort is generating more attention as the Justice Department moves now to reclassify cannabis as a less harmful substance, a move recommended by the Health Department. I spoke earlier with Congressman Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, who founded the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. Yes, there is one, about rescheduling marijuana.
We've now seen 38 states have legalized medical cannabis. We have 28 states that have fully legalized adult use. Many of these are by a vote of the people. We now have over 70% of the public that thinks that cannabis should be completely legalized. This decision by the Biden administration to deal with reality and schedule it as Schedule 3 rather than Schedule 1 is really extraordinarily important. It's going to allow state legal cannabis businesses to deduct their business expenses for tax purposes. Right now, they pay 2-3 times more than typical. So this is going to be earth-shattering. It's going to lead, I think, to the Safe Banking Act through the Senate in the near future, and it's starting the revolution.
All of those would be big developments here. Your colleague, Steve Scalise, the majority leader, sees things rather differently, as, of course, you know, Congressman. He had this to say after the development on rescheduling. We need to be reducing the number of people that use drugs and not increasing that number. We should not be making matters worse, he said. Where's the disagreement here? Because you're talking about the war on drugs, and he is as well, Congressman. How would you respond to Steve Scalise?
Well, the states that have the most draconian drug laws have not reduced the use. In fact, states that don't have a system like we have in Oregon actually puts more risk for youngsters. Somebody who's getting their marijuana from a corner drug dealer, nobody checks ID, nobody deals with a license that they lose, and it's available in every state. Steve is just in the ozone. In fact, the majority of people in his own state support legalization. And having more draconian enforcement is not going to make a difference at all, other than it will disrupt some lives.
Part of my conversation earlier with Congressman Blumenauer, who's been a champion of these changes. Kaylee, it's interesting that we're in a world here where Steve Scalise is criticizing the Democrat pro-marijuana is calling the Republican somewhere in orbit or in the ozone. The question is, will safe banking for cannabis be attached to this FAA reauthorization? That would be the next big move.
Especially when Bloomberg is reporting that Mike Johnson is a little reluctant to attach unrelated measures to the legislation. If it's not with this, what vehicle could get it across the finish line?
We'll keep tabs on it. It's passed the House a number of times already. Coming up, Secretary of State Blinken meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today. We'll talk to Jane Harman about it next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Even as we're working with relentless determination to get the ceasefire that brings the hostages home, we also have to be focused on people in Gaza who are suffering in this crossfire Hamas is making. And so focused on getting them the assistance they need. The food, the medicine, the water, the shelter is also very much on our minds and in the work that we're doing.
That was Secretary of State Antony Blinken stressing the need to get aid into Gaza while visiting Israel earlier today, where he met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other officials as he continues to push for a temporary ceasefire deal with Hamas. Joining us now is Jane Harman, National Defense Strategy Commission Chair and former Congresswoman from California, where, of course, she was ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee, and you have vast experience in the Middle East. Thank you so much for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
In person.
It is lovely to have you in studio. This is the 7th time we have seen Antony Blinken make a trip to the Middle East since October 7th. Oftentimes, he walks away empty-handed or with nothing really tangible to show for it. Will this time be different?
Well, I think he deserves combat pay for all the traveling he's doing. Have you seen the size of the circles under his eyes? And 7 times, obviously, it means a huge effort. And we don't know what's going on in private, so let's understand that. I mean, it is reported that Israel is making a very large, generous offer now for hostages. I think the hostages have to come home yesterday while they're still alive, and humanitarian aid also has to happen yesterday across Gaza. Rage is not a strategy. And sadly, I think the way Israel handled its response to the October 7 heinous attacks has caused a huge backlash against Israel, even in the United States. That's why college campuses are exploding.
God knows that's true. And we keep asking if Joe Biden politically would be helped here at home by a ceasefire. Jane, what would be an appropriate time? We're not talking about a permanent ceasefire, correct? Benjamin Netanyahu is still holding the invasion of Rafah over heads.
Well, I think the conversation is about a temporary ceasefire, a pause, in exchange for return of some amount of hostages, in exchange for release of some amount of political prisoners by Israel. And I think that's what the deal has been. That doesn't fix everything. The humanitarian aid and the return of the hostages are musts right this minute. But the rest of it, seems to me, and I think most people are still talking this way, has to become some kind of pathway to two states. I really think that's the ultimate solution, and I don't think that Israel will be safe without that. And I frankly think that there is an effort now to put some more pressure on Bibi Netanyahu, who's the holdout, and who is holding out to keep power and to keep himself out of jail. Maybe there is some work out there, some temporary shared power and a pardon. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the thrust of it in order to move along. I mean, just one other point. Biden told Bibi, take the win, when a coalition, including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, France, and the UK, fended off this massive drone and missile attack by Iran. What I think take the win means is not only was Israel safe from that, but also this coalition is willing to help Israel. Attention Israel. There are folks out there who will not only work with you, but probably recognize you as a state soon if this policy can be changed.
Yeah, of course, it was the U.S. and the U.K. who stepped up to aid Israeli defenses. Jordan as well had air defense involved when all of that was ongoing. There is an ongoing question as well, Jane, about Saudi Arabia. Bloomberg is reporting today that the U.S. and the Saudis are nearing a pact that would offer security guarantees in exchange for a path toward diplomatic ties with Israel. We were talking about normalization in this relationship prior to October 7th. Is it too early to be restarting this effort again when there still is no temporary ceasefire deal? We don't know what is going to happen in Rafah.
Well, there has to be a return of hostages and humanitarian aid yesterday. But I also think it is not too early. I think that the package that includes a short and long-term vision for this is what will make both parts happen faster. Hamas is using the hostages for leverage. It's kind of out of gas now. It's lost most of its fighters, and I certainly think the militants in Hamas cannot hold any power in Gaza when this moves forward. But I think there probably is some kind of deal that would even make Hamas go away. I don't know what that is yet, but if the Palestinian Authority rejects it, the Palestinian Authority recognizes Israel's right to exist. It's only Hamas that doesn't. And if all these other states do too, I don't know that Hamas has any room to maneuver.
In that scenario, then, would that prevent, do you think, Israel from going after Hezbollah to the north? Because many have wondered that would just tip over the apple cart and we start from scratch.
Well, Hezbollah has been fairly measured. Iran is claiming it doesn't have full control over Hezbollah. Yeah, right. But I think that a deal, short and long term, could really hem in Iran. And there are some other conversations about enhanced sanctions against Iran. And a lot of moving parts. I think that's why Tony Blinken looks so tired. But Charlie Cook was just on talking about how the economy is hurting Biden's poll numbers. I think being ensnared endlessly in the Middle East is too. And I also think it's important for the U.S. to continue to show leadership. I'm so relieved that Congress passed the package of aid both for Israel and Ukraine. Thank goodness that it did a week or so ago.
Yeah, and we know it was very hard to get done. It was a months-long effort that it ultimately took. And yet, to your point, the U.S. did sign on to provide more aid to Israel. Arms are still flowing. As you talk about the political difficulty for Biden of trying to be supportive of Israel and its right to exist, while it may have the administration may have difficulties with the Israeli government. At the end of the day, there is no way for the U.S. to walk away from Israel militarily, right? And that is the root of this problem.
Defensive arms, not offensive arms. There's a rumor that we provided some form of bombs to Israel today. I hope that is not true. I'd also like to make one other point about the campus chaos that we're undergoing, which has a lot to do with the view of which side is right on Gaza and Israel. And that is anyone checking out whether there is foreign malign influence? I mean, who's buying the tents? Who's paying for the signs? Who possibly is moving some of the protesters who are not students from site to site? Could it possibly be a country like Russia, which is already, we know this, involved in disinformation campaigns in our politics?
You're asking really interesting questions here, and I don't know we'll get the answers soon, but some are calling on Joe Biden to go to one of these campuses. Tom Cotton, we just heard a moment ago, who also, by the way, has called for the National Guard to go to campus. Yeah. Is Joe Biden doing the right thing next week? The Holocaust Memorial Service, is that the right venue?
Well, that is something that really matters to the world. It was, it must be celebrated, and Joe Biden is right to do that. That doesn't mean that he has to applaud every single step Israel is taking. But the Holocaust was the largest catastrophe. I mean, I guess the cost of World War I and II were too, but the largest catastrophe against the Jewish people in history. And the second largest was October 7. And yes, he should be doing that. So I agree with that.
It's great to have you at the table. Thanks for coming to see us.
Nice to see you both.
See that in person. Jane Harman, we thank you for being here on Balance of Power. Coming up, two GOP hardliners announcing they will force a vote to oust House Speaker Mike Johnson, an effort likely doomed thanks to Democratic support for the Republican Speaker. Marjorie Taylor Greene says she'll pull the trigger next week. We'll assemble our political panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We've made clear this is a vote of conscience, a procedural vote on a motion to table, but also a vote of conscience that every single member of the House Democratic Caucus will make a decision on based on their assessment of the situation.
Hakeem Jeffries, of course, the Democratic leader in the House, reflecting earlier on Democratic support, organized support, it seems, for Speaker Mike Johnson in the face of a motion to vacate that we learned this morning will in fact be pursued by Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tom Massey. We're joined now by our political panel, Lisa Camuso-Miller, former communications director at the RNC, alongside Caitlin Legacki, partner at Four Corners Public Affairs. It's great to have you both back at the table here. Lisa, now that we know this is actually happening, you worked for a Speaker of the House. What does it mean when Democrats are the only way for you to succeed? Marjorie Taylor Greene is calling him the Democratic Speaker. She's going to try to fire him next week. Not a great look for him moving forward, is it?
Well, you know, it's so hard to say. I mean, the narrow margin that there is in this majority, there was the slimmest margin we can ever remember in all of our histories and in life, makes it so difficult to do business that he has to do business, bipartisan business, in order to stay in charge and get the job done. And so to me, as much as we sort of call this the back and the forth, giving Marjorie Taylor Greene the microphone to talk about this in this way is quite silly. I mean, we have so much work to do in the House that I think that if nothing else, everyone else is acting like an adult, and her call to get rid of Mike Johnson is actually quite foolish.
Okay, well, it raises the question, Lisa. Obviously, there are implications for the Speaker, but what are the implications for the Congresswoman? Is it actually the better scenario for her to act on this, so it didn't look like she was bluffing, have Democrats shoot it down, and she comes out better for that politically than if she were just to back away entirely?
I don't get the sense she's ever going to back down just based on her behavior in the past. I think that this is exactly the way she saw this coming. I think that if there was even 2 more people in the majority in the Republicans' favor, this nonsense would not be happening. But it is so incredibly slim that it gives people like Marjorie Taylor Greene more of a voice and more power. And that's fleeting. It's definitely going to change one way or the other by the time we get to November.
It's been suggested that Hakeem Jeffries actually decided to do this to put Marjorie Taylor Greene on the spot and, in fact, invoke or prompt a vote at some point, because nobody was talking about this a couple of minutes ago. It seemed like it was fading out. Donald Trump was giving Mike Johnson cover. In come the Democrats to save Mike Johnson, leaving her no choice but to say, yeah, I'm going to do it next week. Is that what's really going on here?
No, I think that Democrats realize this is an opportunity to present themselves as the mature adults in the room who are focused on seeking compromise and governing where we can. Mm-hmm. To be clear, there is not a single Democrat who likes the idea that Mike Johnson is Speaker right now. But the alternative of giving Marjorie Taylor Greene yet another platform to act out and throw her various temper tantrums is just not good for the country. And it presents the Democrats with a chance to really show that juxtaposition.
Well, and you say there's not a single Democrat that really wants Mike Johnson to be the Speaker, maybe because at the end of the day what they really want is the majority, so Hakeem Jeffries would be the Speaker. But isn't part of this also Mike Johnson is not Kevin McCarthy. He has not conducted himself with the Democrats and Democratic leadership in the same way that McCarthy did, which is why his fate may turn out to be very different.
That's right. I mean, you know, while Kevin McCarthy was in charge, there were a lot of really big trust issues between the Democratic caucus and the Republican conference. And what we have seen from Mike Johnson in the past couple months is that he has been willing to do the right thing when it comes to Ukraine aid, Israel aid, and put his speakership on the line to do the right thing. And so I think that while no one is enthusiastic about many of the positions he holds, it is a vote of trust and confidence that there will continue to be this working relationship.
Mm-hmm. The right thing for him is likely not going to include legalizing cannabis, which was in the air today. It's not 420, but there's been news on this with rescheduling of cannabis. And a Senate Majority Leader today, Chuck Schumer, who reintroduced a bill to legalize marijuana and talked about the reclassification. Here's what he said.
I was pleased by yesterday's news that the DEA under the Biden administration is preparing to take a truly historic step, rescheduling cannabis from a Schedule I substance to a Schedule III under the Controlled Substances Act.
Lisa, this appears to be moving with public support. There is a vast majority, it seems, of Americans that support this for medical and for recreational. This is a non-starter for a lot of particularly older lawmakers. Joe Biden doesn't even seem all that comfortable with it. Steve Scalise says, no way. Is this going anywhere in this Congress, or is this a generational thing that we're talking about the next few
It's
years?
hard to predict if anything's going to get done in this Congress, Joe. I mean, I feel like we've talked about a lot of these issues. But I do think that this is an issue that actually could be very good for the economy. And I think that the economy and the marketplace is actually really one that we should look to and follow in this place. Yes, do I think that it will be a generational change and there will be people that will ultimately not be for this? But it is definitely an economic decision and one that could be very good for the U.S. economy at a time when it continues to need some boosting.
Well, Joe spoke with the founder of the Cannabis Caucus in Congress, who sits on the Ways and Means Committee earlier today, who was talking about the revenue generation that this could create. But part of this, too, isn't just whether or not you pass it, Caitlin, but how you pass it. If it were to get attached to something that needs to get done, like the FAA bill, which is facing a deadline of May 10th. Is this actually responsible legislating to say, OK, we're not going to throw a bunch of random things on here to make it less likely to pass must-pass legislation?
You know, I have learned to never doubt the wisdom of Chuck Schumer on how to get bills passed. But I also think that we are underestimating the amount of bipartisan support that this type of measure has, both when it comes to spurring the economy. Right now, there's billions and billions of dollars that are operating in a gray market that we should be putting into our banks. But also, you know, when you look at the states that have passed these state regulations, it's universally popular. You know, you're passing it in South Dakota with 60%, 70% of the vote. So I actually think it's good politics, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of outcry or backlash if that happens. But I could see this being a mobilizing issue for people who vote against it.
right, Caitlin Legacki and Lisa Camusa-Miller will be sticking with us because coming up, the Arizona Senate votes to repeal the state's Civil War-era abortion ban as Florida's 6-week ban goes into effect today. We'll have more on the abortion issue with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
As of this morning, 4 million women in this state woke up with fewer reproductive freedoms than they had last night.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris earlier in Jacksonville, Florida, as the state's 6-week abortion ban went into effect today. Back with us now, Lisa Camusa-Miller, former RNC Communications Director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast, and Caitlin Legacki, partner at Four Corners Public Affairs. So, Caitlin, we've seen Biden go to Florida. We have now seen the vice president go to Florida to highlight the abortion issue, and obviously it is very relevant there, especially on a day like today. Is Florida, though, actually in play because of this issue? I think that's the question we all have.
It's really hard to say. I think the Biden campaign is taking a really smart approach in keeping Florida in the maybe column, keeping it active, seeing what kind of traction they can build there. And then, it remains to be seen whether they're going to start spending money there, and that's when the rubber meets the road. But you've got a competitive Senate race. Clearly, you've got a governor there who is nationally very unpopular. And the fact of the matter is, even though, whether or not Florida comes into play later on, the vice president's making national news there today on an issue that is relevant throughout the country. And so it has ripple effects that will still yield value for them.
It was a pretty direct line from Donald Trump to the end of Roe v. Wade. And he talked about this issue on the campaign trail. Today was a day off court for the former president who showed up in Wisconsin. Here's what he said.
Basically, the states decide on abortion, and people are absolutely thrilled with the way that's going on. Every state's different.
Lisa, people are not absolutely thrilled with what's going on here. And his lack of announcement or a stand on this, leave it to the states, is what he said, brings us right back to the end of Roe v. Wade. How much of a problem is this for him on the campaign trail?
Well, his base is hardened, and they'll be with him regardless of whatever policy position he takes on just about any issue. Right, they're with him
because of this.
Women voters, all day long. Women voters. I mean, his lack of position, his lack of clarity on what he would do when he arrives at the White House again if he's reelected, the lack of clarity about where he is on a variety of the policies in this particular area in women's health, I think have a lot of people concerned. And he's not clear about it at all. Every time it's that kind of words that are like a salad of words that make no sense to people like us who are in the communications business. So to me, I think that continues to be an issue for women voters that ordinarily might consider a Republican candidate. This one, if he's not clear on the issue, will definitely be a problem for him in the ballot.
Well, if you read the transcript of the interview that Trump did with Time about this, being asked repeatedly whether or not he would veto a federal abortion ban, his answer was effectively that it would never make it to my desk because you won't get 60 votes in the Senate, which sounded eerily familiar to what Nikki Haley was saying when she was still in the running. Just on the idea of what's happening in various states, though, Caitlin, it's also worth pointing out today in Arizona, the state Senate, following the House, repealed the Civil War-era ban, 1864 law that effectively banned it entirely, except for in the case of the life of the mother. That is a swing state. Did the state Senate just hurt Biden's chances of claiming victory there?
It brought us from 1864 to 1964. Like the 15-week ban that they have is still pre-Roe. It is still wildly restrictive for women who are experiencing very serious health complications. And while the median voter is okay with some abortion restrictions, the issue that Republicans face is that when push comes to shove and a woman has to choose between a policy that brings government into the doctor's office or not, they don't want government in the doctor's office. And so I think that women in Arizona especially have seen what people are willing to do in government there, and it's quite alarming. And I think it shows that this is a live issue that still has to be addressed.
Great conversation with Caitlin Legacki and Lisa Camuso Miller. It's always a pleasure to have both of you with us. Another smart panel on Balance of Power. Kaylee, we're not going to be done talking about this between now and November. It's just another one of these issues that will bring us straight through the election. And you can read a lot more about all the issues we discussed today in the Washington Edition newsletter. Find it on the terminal and online.
And you can find us back here tomorrow. Thank you for joining on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.